Now, at the same time, the 27th UN Climate Conference has kicked off in the Egyptian city of Sharm El Sheikh. President William Ruto jetted out of the country for the conference that comes at a time of record-breaking floods, devastating droughts and heat waves across the world.
Well, this year's climate conference in Africa comes amid calls for financial aid to help poorer nations cope with and adapt to climate change. Well, Citizen TV's Ayub Abdikadir puts into perspective the conference and the race towards the long-term goal of limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
We must act urgently to keep global heating levels below 1.5 degrees centigrade, help those in need, promote the use of renewable energy, and thus end addiction to fossil fuels.
The head of state, who is also the chairman of the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change, jetted out of the country earlier today. So crucial are these climate talks that President William Ruto will deliver his statement, and also on behalf of Africa, a continent that is bearing the brunt of climate change. But even before Ruto can deliver his message, it was an early win for Kenya and other developing countries majorly across the continent, following an agreement to formally include discussions on the financing of loss and damage resulting from climate change effects. The conference's president, Sameh Shukri, told the meeting that financing of loss and damages is one of the issues to be discussed by members within the 14-day event. The continent is the least contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions, with about 3.8%, yet adversely affected by climate change consequences. This with calls from civil society groups urging the more than 150 world leaders to scale up funding. What the world is witnessing now are not the consequences of the power of Mother Nature, but the consequences of human activities and the inaction to immune against it. Beyond the pledges and the compromises and the purely aspirational COP26 Glasgow Agreement in the UK, can the world reach a climate consensus in Egypt and cap the globally rising temperatures? The climate conference coming against the backdrop of calls for richer countries to commit more resources to mitigate the consequences of climate change, especially in Africa, that is expected to table tangible demands to counter climate change impacts, and a call to wealthy countries to provide climate adaptation finance to the vulnerable. Scientists say failure by major polluting countries to cut greenhouse emissions puts the world on course for 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which is above the pre-industrial temperature levels as well as the needed 1.5 degrees Celsius. Even in the most optimistic scenario, taking into account the long-term commitments of the Paris 2015 Climate Accord and the 2021 Glasgow Climate Conference, scientists say between 400 million people and 1.7 billion people face starvation. Between 130 million people to 190 will lack rain, pointing to further drought consequences, especially in Africa. Between 60 to 70 million people along coastlines will also be affected by rising sea levels, and that hunger will increase between 6 to 8%. Kenya, like many other African nations, has more than 4 million people who have been affected by drought and on the brink of famine, with the government rolling out relief food supplies to the most affected, a clear indication of how climate change-related effects are taking a toll on thousands of Kenyans. A similar situation across the African continent. Ayub Abdikadir, Citizen TV, Nairobi.